but it's idolatry, right? And we know what idolatry is, right? Idolatry is displacing God, pushing God to the side by making good created things more important than God, right? So, and then if your spouse doesn't share your faith, there's great pressure to adapt to that by pushing God more to the margins of your life. You're in an intimate relationship with somebody who doesn't understand that what should be the very mainspring, what should be the very motivation for absolutely everything that you do. And so the natural response then becomes that people start to make God less central to everything. Otherwise, you keep getting all these blank stares from your spouse. And then there's this daily unseen pressure to worship something else. The idols that he or she brings into the relationship, whether knowingly or unknowingly, different values. And so this is the reason the Bible urges believers to not knowingly marry an unbeliever. And I think in our day and age, it's really helpful to broaden this idea of marriage to apply to current trends, to current situations. I mean, when does marriage begin? Couples will come in to see me for premarital counseling, and I will talk with them about the scriptural ideal. I say, well, in the scriptures, the ideal is that the wedding and that living together and starting to have sex, they all happen at the same time. And then usually there's kind of an awkward silence, like now. Right? These things happen all at the same time. That's the scriptural ideal, right? So what do you do when they don't? Because we live in a culture, even a church culture, right, where some couples live together before they're married, where some couples begin to have sex before they're married. And so some of us are actually married before we're married. And then into that context, how do we apply Paul's advice that a Christian who is already married to a non-Christian should not seek divorce, but should actively seek to build a good marriage? Bit of a spoiler alert, we can see already that Samson is not going to be the judge that we hoped for. If you look back at the very beginning of the book of Judges, the first judge is Othniel, and he fought against Israel's enemies, and he married this woman named Aksa, who's a godly, faithful Israelite. And then by the end of the book of Judges, we have Samson, the last judge, and he's engaged to be married to Israel's enemy, this unnamed Philistine woman who has no idea who God is. And so we've seen that the book of Judges has this cycle, right? This pattern of behavior. But there's something missing in our story in this cycle of behavior, namely the bottom, number 4, right? Israel does not cry out for release from oppression at all in this cycle compared to all the other cycles. There's no resistance to this enslavement by the Israelites. And so Israel basically capitulates to the Philistines. And it's far more profound and far more complete here than in any of their previous enslavements in the book of Judges. But the people are virtually unconscious of their enslavement because its nature is that of kind of a cultural accommodation. The Israelites don't groan or resist their captors now because they've adopted and they've adapted the values and the mores and the idols of the Philistines. And so like Samson himself, the Israelites are eager to marry into Philistine society, probably seeing it as a way to kind of move up in the culture. And the Israelites no longer have a recognizable culture of their own, which is based on service to the Lord and a covenant relationship. It's slipped away. It's almost non-existent. And so the danger for Israel is huge. They are on the brink of extinction. Within a couple of generations, they could be completely assimilated into the Philistine nation. In his commentary on the Judges, Michael Wilcock drives this uncomfortable truth home to the church when he writes, "There is no such thing as harmonious coexistence between the church and the world, for when there is no conflict, it's because the world is taken over." And so likewise, the church's efforts at constantly trying to avoid conflict with the world are often a surrender to the world, sometimes even unknowingly. I mean, we know we can make idols out of all sorts of things, right? Material things, status, wealth. We can make idols out of pleasure-seeking, leisure, work. We can make idols out of school and sports and hobbies. We can make idols out of our friends, out of our church, out of our own abilities. Anything that we might put ahead of God can become an idol. And so this invites us to consider how we have surrendered our unique identity as God's covenant children and been assimilated into the world, taken on its values. Now, all that was the first 3 verses, and we got like 2 chapters to go here. But so my point just being that here we come to the hinge verse, right? The whole Samson narrative, this is kind of the key to understanding the whole thing. His parents did not know that this, that is, Samson's overriding desire to marry the Philistine, was from the Lord, who was seeking an occasion to confront the Philistines. Somehow, God will use this very weakness this weakness of Samson, his kind of fraternization with the Philistines, even his sexual appetite, his vindictiveness, his temper, to bring about some sort of conflict between the 2 nations. Samson's weakness results in a blood feud, leads to more and more and more conflict, finally the division between the 2 nations that is needed. And as the story goes on, everybody is responsible for their own ungodly behavior, yet God uses it somehow, all of it, to ensure that the nations become alienated from one another so that his own people don't totally lose their distinctiveness. And so in Judges, God uses his own people's sinfulness to bring about their deliverance. And of course, there's others examples of this in the scriptures, but the supreme example comes in Acts 2, which is the cover verse in the bulletin today, where we see that God used the free, wicked choices of human beings to put Jesus himself to death, therefore redeeming the world from free, wicked choices. And though the people that put to Jesus to death were doing so wickedly, God arranged it so that their sin and sinful behavior only fulfilled his redemptive purposes. And so, as strange as it seems, God in his mercy uses people's weaknesses to make sure that there's not peace between them, Israel and the Philistines, and the surrounding cultures. And I think it's important, as James kind of puts it, God's people need not to be at peace with the world, because friendship with the world is hatred towards God. If we are like the world, we will love the idols. We'll forsake God. We will, as James puts it, be adulterous people. I mean, this is the imagery that Judges is chock full of, especially in and through this graphic example of Samson. I just really like this woodcut. I don't know if you can see it so much, but it's 500 years old, and it illustrates our story. Samson ignores his Nazirite vow, kills a lion with his bare hands, and so he should now be going straight to the tabernacle for cleansing. But instead, because he's on the way to see the woman that he wants, his lust overwhelms his vows. Later again in the story, he touches this dead animal, and he causes his parents as well to be unwittingly unclean as well. And then Samson gambles with the Philistines, his companions, that they won't crack his riddle. The Philistines, in turn, kind of lean on Samson's fiancée, and Samson demonstrates again, as I remember somebody saying once, that he is a he-man with a she-weakness. And then so this smitten Samson cannot help but give the answer. And of course, she passes on the answer to the riddle to her compatriots. Samson impulsively strikes down 30 Philistines, not to save Israel, of course, but just to get even and to pay his debts. And then when his fiancée is given to one of his attendants, he declares, "Now I have a right to get even with the Philistines," and he burns all their fields. And in retaliation for Samson's retaliation, the Philistines burn Samson's wife and her father to death. And then Samson, in turn, swears revenge and slaughtered many Philistines, right? You can see why we've read the whole section. I mean, nobody comes out of this episode looking very good. I mean, Samson shirks his God-given role. He's brutally violent. Philistines are just as bad. Samson, Israel writ small. He's just like God's enemies, just like God's enemies. But in all of this, somehow God is at work. Why can Samson kill a lion? Because the Spirit of the Lord came upon him in power. Why is he able to strike down 30 Philistines to steal their clothes? Because the Spirit of the Lord came upon him in power. Somehow God gives Samson this superhuman strength for him to cause this division between Israel and the Philistines, which God's people, even though they don't realize it, they so desperately need. God is starting to save his people by divorcing them from their marriage to idols and to the world around them. But how can God use people, flawed people, like Samson to get his work done? Shouldn't God only be using people who are good, godly men and women? Shouldn't God be using people who have the right beliefs and the right behavior? I guess the problem with this is it kind of narrows God. It kind of puts him in a box. It would mean that God is limited by humans and it's only allowed to work when people are being good and making godly choices. It would mean that God doesn't work by grace, taking the initiative to save, but that he works only in response to good works, waiting for the help of his people in order to save. Professor David Jackman describes how Judges shoots holes through all of that. He writes, "It is above all, the book of Judges, a book about grace, undeserved mercy, as is the whole Bible. That's not to play down theological accuracy or to pretend it doesn't matter how we behave. We will still suffer from our sins. But we can rejoice that he is also in the business of using our failures as the foundations for his success. Let us never imagine that we have God taped or that we know how he will work or when. As soon as we start to say God cannot or will not until such and such, we are wrong-footed." In volleyball terms, I am wrong-footed. I like to use the term goofy-footed because it makes me sound more foolish. But that is to say that in my approach jump for a spike, I start and end with the wrong foot. It just is. I've tried to change it countless times over the years. I just can't do it. But it reminds me of this truth, that there's this amazing truth that God works through sinners. And God works through sinful situations. And God works through goofy-footed people. He keeps his promise to bless his people even in the dark and disastrous periods of our lives, as well as those times when everything seems to be going right. Somehow, not even our own sin will stop him from using us or saving us. And so in our story, retaliation births retaliation. Without forgiveness and reconciliation, this is just too familiar a story to us. In Judges, this cycle, it just continues on and on and on. And so the Philistines, they take up arms, they make camp at Judah because they want to take Samson prisoner and do to him as he did to us. And Judah is so keen to remain at peace with the Philistines that they cannot see that God has raised up for them a judge to save them. And when they discover that he has, they send 3,000 men to hand the judge over to the enemy. And so they may bear the name of God's people, but they'd rather live at peace with the world and worship their idols than be freed to worship God. They'd rather cut down their own rescuer than risk this confrontation with the world. And so they tie up their own judge and they take him to the Philistines. Again, though, one more time, the Spirit of the Lord comes upon him in power. And Samson breaks free from his bonds. And he finds the fresh jawbone of a donkey, a dead animal. And, clearly he's totally forsaken his Nazirite vows by this point. And he grabs it and he strikes down 1,000 men. He taunts them as he kills them. And then for the very first time, Samson speaks to God. Speaks to the God who has chosen to empower him. And what does he pray? Sadly, his prayer is neither humble nor faithful. He basically demands that God help him, and he complains that God doesn't, which is remarkably clueless of him because God's Spirit is the one that has rescued him from a lion and from a lost bet and now from 1,000 Philistines. Samson uses